We've been looking at the progressive era and the antecedents, really, the precursors to the progressive movement. Progressivism, as we learned last time, was a political movement in which its followers wanted to bring about social change at all levels, using the power of government to accomplish that change. And they were quite successful in local, especially state levels, and that's where we concluded last time, was in the state governors that accomplished a lot of the progressive ideas. But it was really the national platform and national politics where progressivism seized the high ground, if you will, where other political movements had failed. The Greenback Labor Party had some success at the state level, but never was able to take that larger step to the national level. The populist movement had some success, even nominating William Jennings Bryan at one point, but it never really catapulted itself to a national stage. Remember, progressives are in all parties. They are in all groups. They are Republicans, they are Democrats, they are populist. So they bridge the spectrum, and they bring almost a coalition of reform-minded people. And so at the national level is where progressivism took root and gained, for at least a short span of time, a national following and a national platform. I would even argue as a historian that you can see the roots of progressivism and what they wanted to accomplish, that long list of ideas that I put forward last time. You can see those carried through not only the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson, but then after World War I and the retirement of Wilson, you get a step away from reform. You get the 1920s. But Franklin Roosevelt grew up in this period, and so when he ascends to the presidency in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt, a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, when he becomes president, he resurrects a lot of these long forgotten issues or long sidetracked issues and brings them forward and puts them in place with the New Deal. And then I would even argue further that anything that the progressives desired to accomplish, even though now we're calling them New Dealers, it will then be a student of Franklin Roosevelt's, Lyndon Johnson, who will then take that one step further and will try to implement the rest of the package as a social safety net with his Great Society of the 1960s. And so let's look at the politics of the progressive era. And it begins with a president that you wouldn't think of, but he's in office at the time of the progressive period. You don't think of William McKinley as a progressive president, although there are signs that he was a reformer, and a lot of the things that Theodore Roosevelt will later accomplish, it's William McKinley that had first thought them through and had suggested possible implementation, such as bringing corporations under control and breaking up of monopolies and things like that. And I know history books, especially textbooks, tend to talk about William McKinley being a political party animal and in the back pocket of big business, Marcus Hanna and others. But biographers tend to shy away from that. They tend to show William McKinley as being his own man, although he's not as radical a reformer as those who will follow him. In 1900 is an election year, and William McKinley is running for re-election, having won the Spanish-American War in 1898, having added to the national domain, having shepherded through Congress the acquisition of the Philippines, Wake, Guam, the annexation of Hawaii, Puerto Rico. He's extended the national domain, so Americans are proud. The economy is roaring with natural resources pouring into the United States from those newly acquired territories, with those territories serving as markets for American goods. with Americans in their missionary efforts going out to those remote islands and opening up China, both for religious purposes and business purposes. The United States is busting at the seams. All the gloom and doom of the Charles Darwins and the John Fists and the Josiah Strongs have been put aside. That the United States is not going to implode. It is now exploding with energy. And so William McKinley, as the architect of that victory and the architect of the economy, there's little chance that he's going to lose the election of 1900. But the Democrats bring back William Jennings Bryan. And William Jennings Bryan, that Pied Piper to the populist masses, has a very dangerous appeal in the minds of William McKinley. And he believes that his running mate needs to be somebody with the energy and zeal that McKinley just simply doesn't have and couldn't show because of his invalid wife. McKinley intends to run a front porch campaign just like he did in 1896. He doesn't intend to cross the nation. He will give as few speeches as possible. He will speak from his house in Ohio. He'll speak from the White House. He'll use what later Theodore Roosevelt will call the bully pulpit. But he's not going to go out and stump speak across the nation. William Jennings Bryan, on the other hand, is going to be a tornado of activity. He's going to log thousands of miles and thousands of speeches, driving home his swan song of free unlimited coinage of silver, a departure from the gold standard, easy credit and money for everyone, an end to big business, breakup of the monopolies, an end to tariffs. And his message has appeal. And so to counter that, William McKinley chooses a national hero, the icon of the Spanish-American War, Theodore Roosevelt, who is now serving as governor of New York. Add to that, the Republican machine bosses in New York don't like Roosevelt. They don't like that he is a reformer, and as he takes control of New York, he is instituting reforms that cut deep into their pockets and in their power structure. And so they encourage Roosevelt to accept the nomination as vice president, to kick him upstairs, to get him out of the way. To borrow the words of a future vice president from Texas, John Nance Garner, he referred to the U.S. vice presidency as no more important than a bucket of warm piss. And the news media always cleans it up and says he said a bucket of warm spit, but he didn't. The vice presidency was a road to nowhere. The vice president was not seen as the heir apparent to the White House. The Secretary of State was the heir apparent. They're the ones out doing things. The vice president is just sitting around doing whatever mundane jobs the president gives them and waiting for something possibly to happen to the president and hoping that it won't, but also kind of hoping that it will so they can take their turn in the big chair. So Roosevelt was the good choice for vice president. He's popular. He's effective. While at times being a lightning rod of controversy, Theodore Roosevelt was a whirlwind of activity. He will out-travel Bryan. He will outspeak Bryan. He will out-zeal Bryan. And in every manner and in every way, Roosevelt proves to be not only the equal of William Jennings Bryan, but to even be better. And train after train as he travels the country. Whenever he arrives at a new speaking engagement and steps out on the back platform of the train to address the crowds, there are always in those crowds the khaki, pinned-up, hatted, blue-shirted, blue-spotted, bandana-wearing Rough Riders who had accompanied Roosevelt in the Spanish-American War. They were the first to make sure that Roosevelt got respect in those crowds, by force if necessary. And they proved to be an excellent spokesman for the future vice president. And so the campaign of 1900, which really didn't have to have Roosevelt, but it was good that it did. You can see the campaign poster with McKinley and Roosevelt on it. And you can see their platform is solid. They can show in 1896 there was an economic depression and factories were closing. It's 1900, look at your factories now. They couldn't run at greater capacity. The banks were closing in 1896. People were unemployed. And the run on the banks was to take your money out. In 1900, it's to put money in. Because labor is profiting, because business is humming, and American workers are happy. Cuba was enslaved. Now Cuba is under American rule. What does William Jennings Bryan have? Well, you can see on his campaign poster his call for liberty, for justice, for humanity. Equal rights for all. Special privileges to none. This sound familiar? The two parties have been recycling these slogans, have been reusing these ideas for well over a century. And so in the race for the White House, the American public votes their pocketbook. And William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt sustain a substantial victory. The solid South remaining solidly behind Bryan. There's not much Bryan could have done that would have cost him the vote in the South. But certainly the Montana and Idaho and Nevada and their electoral votes going for Bryan are a reflection of their populism. Those are silver-producing areas of the country. Bryan is offering them a huge step forward economically. So they're populist votes for them. But even more telling is that Wyoming, Wyoming and Utah support McKinley. And in that, McKinley's able to make huge inroads into Bryan territory. Bryan didn't even carry his home state. And so President McKinley is elected for another 4 years. And almost a dream team, Secretary of State John Hay, one of the greatest Secretary of States the United States has ever had. Elihu Root as Secretary of War. And in fact, that's going to be McKinley's next test. No sooner, and even as the election is taking place, President McKinley has to commit troops to a ground offensive in China. China is kind of the sick man of Asia. The monarchy of China is collapsing with all of the foreign interest, foreign imperial powers pouring into China and carving China up into small little fiefdoms. And in fact, the pictures on the bottom of the PowerPoint are watercolors, are paintings done at the time of various troops. You can see Japanese troops in China. You can see German troops in China, Italian troops in China. All of the nations were in China. And you can see the 8 major powers: Great Britain, the United States, Russia, Germany, Japan, France, Italy, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But on the other side, as the Chinese monarchy is collapsing, there is an ultra-nationalist group that is fighting to preserve the territorial and social integrity of China. They are called the Society of the Righteous Fist, or the Society of the Raised Fist, the Boxers, as they were known by the West. They were ultra-nationalist, and they began attacking foreign missionaries. They began attacking foreign settlements in China, even to the point in 1900 of laying siege to the embassies of those 8 powers in the city of Peking. And with the international quarters, as it was called, right outside the Forbidden City, in the international quarters, those 8 countries had to work together to defend their embassies from the Boxers and their secret support from the Chinese army. Over 200 missionaries and others were murdered. And the contingents from each embassy's military plus the diplomats were stuck in Peking. And the international community dispatched a force of 18,000 soldiers to put down the Boxer Rebellion. And so William McKinley will preside yet over another effective military campaign. The siege of the diplomatic quarters was relieved in time, saving the diplomats from execution at the hands of the Boxers. And the international community then punished China with a fine, an indemnity of $333 million for the depredations of the Boxers. The United States was to receive $24.5 million of that, which McKinley and then later Roosevelt decided that was far more than their commitment to the putting down the Boxer Rebellion, and so they give back to China something like $18 million of it, and then they use the rest of the money to foster foreign exchange students and bring Chinese students to America for education. So in effect, the United States returns most of the money or puts it in for charitable causes. One of the results of the Boxer Rebellion was that President McKinley issued through Secretary of State John Hay a series of memorandums calling for the open door in China. They were known as open door notes, declaring that it wasn't right for any nation to tear out any part of China's territory and maintain it for exclusive control. In other words, calling for the preservation of China and allowing all nations to trade in all parts of China. And while initially this will be rejected, it becomes increasingly obvious to the European powers that this is a more wise course. Now, the one power that, however, does not particularly care for the open door, well, the two powers, Russia and Japan, while openly avowing support for the open door, are going to secretly be preparing to dismember China at their earliest convenience, which happens in the late 1920s and all through the 1930s. So President McKinley is extremely popular. He's been reelected. He's fought yet another war. The Orient is open for American business. He's at the height of his power, which then rubs Leon Czolgosz, an anarchist, the wrong way, thinking that McKinley is too powerful, that McKinley is well on his way to becoming a dictator. Leon Czolgosz, disguised as a waiter, will enter the Buffalo World's Fair, the Pan American exhibition that you can see in the center is the Temple of Music. And you can see in the photo of McKinley walking up the steps, the last photo taken of McKinley, as he goes into the Temple of Music to listen to a concert and to view the exhibition, Leon Czolgosz walks up and shoots him. Now, he doesn't die immediately. He lingers for a while, but the infections from the wound will kill President McKinley. For the Republican establishment, this was the most horrific thing that could have ever happened. Theodore Roosevelt was now President of the United States. With Theodore Roosevelt president, it was assumed he would begin his reform that he had advocated before as a governor, that he would begin implementing this in the national scene. And to everyone's surprise, as you can see from the cartoon, Roosevelt read over and ultimately followed McKinley's policies, assuring his cabinet and assuring the nation, and more importantly, assuring business and the stock market that he was not going to do anything radical. So instead, he maintains McKinley's policies throughout the rest of what would have been McKinley's term, while setting the stage for the 1904 campaign. And so a lot of the issues we talk about in Roosevelt's second term are issues that actually begin here and carry over. So don't be confused by the dates. But Roosevelt, for the most part, maintains McKinley's policies. And you have the first president of the United States, as you can see from the badges I put on there. You can see that he was both a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize and of the Congressional Medal of Honor. And the two medals, the one with the red ribbon is the medal that he would have received if he got it in 1898 or 1900. If he had received it when he was nominated, that's the one he would have received. That's how the Congressional Medal of Honor looked then for someone who served in the Army. The other one with the blue ribbon is the one that Roosevelt actually received posthumously from President Bill Clinton, which is the modern Congressional Medal of Honor. Theodore Roosevelt, as a reformer, carries on McKinley's policies into the campaign of 1904. In 1903 and into 1904 as a campaign year, Roosevelt advocates a platform called the Square Deal. The Square Deal. And I'm telling you that as part of the campaign, but we're going to break it down as his second term unfolds. I hate to ruin the suspense of the election, but he's going to win. And we're going to break down his square deal into the four elements and show how he carried this out in his domestic and foreign policy. But for 1904, Theodore Roosevelt is the overwhelming choice of the Republicans, and the Democrats turn to Alton Brooks Parker. But the election's not even going to be close. But Roosevelt's going to campaign on what he called the Square Deal. There are four parts to the Square Deal. The first is the control of corporations. Second is consumer protection. 3 is conservation. And 4 is construction of a canal. I've worked those so they all start with C's. Control of corporations, consumer protection, conservation, and construct a canal. So Theodore Roosevelt's Square Deal is predicated on a sound reform domestic policy and a sound international policy. For business, they hold their nose and vote for TR. They know he has promised consumer protection. They know that he has promised control of corporations. But he's still better than the left-leaning Alton Parker. But Roosevelt's popularity with the American people, they love Teddy. And if you had known or been around with Theodore Roosevelt, he seized your imagination. He's one of those political figures that's just simply larger than life. Everything that he did was big. From his bicuspids, his grin that showed teeth, to his larger-than-life living, having been a cowboy in the Dakotas and been on safari and been a Rough Rider, been a representative to the New York Assembly, having been governor of New York. The man had done everything. He was known to be a voracious reader, and yet he was a sound family man. Roosevelt was popular and the people loved him, and it showed on Election Day. The Solid South stayed with Parker, but Roosevelt swept everything else. To borrow a phrase, I don't care who you are, that's a whooping. And so Roosevelt rearranges the cabinet a little bit to fit his, keeps some, gets rid of others, but Roosevelt is now on a mission, reflecting things that he had done before, but he is now on a mission for reform. And that reform is going to be focused, first off, on controlling the corporations. Controlling the corporations. So what we see is Roosevelt calling for a square deal for labor. And these are all Puck or Judge cartoons, but you see the infant Hercules, Roosevelt taking on the Hydra, or charging up David Hill, a railroad mogul. Roosevelt's not afraid to take him on, or to use his Attorney General Altgeld, which is the cartoon in the middle, putting the squeeze on the trusts and on monopolies, which, by the way, is the more precise use of the term to screw somebody. It comes from a medieval torture device that was put around their waist and used to break their sternum, to squeeze their insides. So when you say put the screws to somebody, it's tightening the screws on that torture device. You see the Jack-in-the-Box Roosevelt bringing doomsday to business that has bad practices. Now Roosevelt is clear to say he's not against all business. He's not going to be a Woodrow Wilson that is against all monopolies. Roosevelt says there's a difference between good business and bad business, and he is against bad business. And he wants to reform bad business, to break up bad trust. But if you're a business that produces a good product at a good price, he's got no problem with you. And so Roosevelt takes on the corporations using laws that are already on the books that we've already looked at, the Interstate Commerce Commission and the Interstate Commerce Act. Roosevelt's going to advocate in 1903, he had advocated the Elkins Act, E-L-K-I-N-S, the Elkins Act, which stopped rebates on railroads. And remember, that's a jab at John Rockefeller, who would force railroads to give him a kickback. That's what we would call it today, not a rebate. We would call it a kickback for shipping on their railroad, and then charging his competition more. So it imposed heavy fines on railroads that gave rebates and on the shippers that accepted them. So it attacked both ends of the problem. In 1906, he would further his control of corporations with the Hepburn Act. The Hepburn Act of 1906, which restricted the use of free passes, especially by congressmen and senators on railroads. Congressmen and senators have to travel from Washington, D.C. to their home districts quite frequently. Well, railroads gave government officials free passes to ride, and their family members free passes to ride on the railroad. But the Hepburn Act says that smacks of bribery. It smacks of corruption. So it eliminates free passes. And it expands the control of the Interstate Commerce Commission to nullify shipping rates whenever there's a complaint against a shipper that they are discriminating for the long haul or the short haul. They're discriminating between shippers on the same railroad. The ICC could come in, freeze the railroad, take over control of the railroad, put a receiver in place until they investigated and determined whether the allegations were true. And so what that means is the railroad could lose a lot of money while the investigation took place. And so they quickly reformed their practices to prevent even the slightest hint of wrongdoing. Roosevelt would actually initiate his first antitrust legislation in 1902. 1902. Roosevelt will file suit against the Northern Securities Company. Northern Securities was a railroad holding company, a conglomerate of J.P. Morgan and James J. Hill. James J. Hill and Morgan controlled all the railroads in the Northwest. And this is the first antitrust lawsuit of its kind in U.S. history. And taking Morgan and Hill to court is a monumental thing. Morgan believed that Roosevelt was crazy and that he was trying to undermine the fundamental structure of American business. But the Supreme Court agreed with Roosevelt that the combination of Morgan and Hill and the pooling of their resources into this holding company was a combination in restraint of trade, and they ordered the company broken up. And so Roosevelt has his first success in breaking up a trust, breaking up a monopoly, and he will go on over the course of his second term in office, 1905 through 1909, to initiate 40 different antitrust lawsuits. In 1905, the Supreme Court will declare the beef trust illegal. They will declare the sugar trust illegal, the fertilizer trust, the harvester trust, and they go after these big combinations that have been restraining trade and preventing an unmonopolized marketplace. And so Roosevelt, while not having the most, he won't initiate the most lawsuits against these monopolies. He chooses his battles and makes sure that he can win them. But he brings control to the corporations. His successors, Taft and Wilson, will do far more, but Roosevelt sets the stage. And the second area of his square deal was consumer protection. He developed the idea of consumer protection in 1906, and even before, but the specific things we're going to talk about, he developed in 1906, reading Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. And it was said after he read The Jungle that he was so nauseated, so sick, that he couldn't eat, and dispatched investigators to determine whether it was true. And so, whether it be the meatpacking plants of Wisconsin and Chicago, or whether it is elixirs designed to do one thing but doing something else, like Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, Roosevelt wants the unadulteration and the clear labeling of products. And so, as a focus of his consumer protection, he will go after groups like this. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound was primarily alcohol, especially in areas that prohibition reigns supreme or temperance. Ladies quite often, because Lydia Pinkham's was targeted toward ladies. And by the way, you can still get Lydia Pinkham's. One of my great regrets is years ago, about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer than that, I was in a drugstore here in Tyler and found a whole shelf full of Lydia Pinkham's modern elixir. And I regret that I didn't buy it, because the next time I went in, they were all gone, and they've quit carrying them. But they are available, and you can order them online. I'm not sure of the alcohol content or anything like that, but it's still sold as a positive cure. And so Lydia Pinkham's, if you read the fine print there, it cures everything from a bowel obstruction to cancer to menopause. It is truly a marvelous compound. And I say that tongue planted in cheek, because it's mostly alcohol back in the day, and women would get quite tipsy. Of course, they were not feeling any pain because they were drunk. As part of Roosevelt's agenda, both for the pure labeling and unadulteration of foods and the inspection of meats, two pieces of legislation are pushed through Congress. Presidents don't enact legislation, so he acts through party members, progressives in the Republican Party in Congress. And the first piece of legislation that he pushes through is the Meat Inspection Act. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906. It calls for government inspectors, which you can see both on the left and right. Government inspectors looking over the process. Having read Upton Sinclair's book and how they would sweep the butcher floors, the killing floors, they would sweep up sawdust, they would sweep up dirt, rope ends, dead rats, roaches, anything that was on the floor. And one of the characters in the book gets this huge pile of debris that he swept up, and he puts it in a wheelbarrow to haul it out, and he asks them, where he should dump it, and they point to the big vat of cooking potted meat. Think in your mind the equivalent of an unregulated spam. And he said, dump it in there. We call that filler. So the government inspectors are designed to make sure none of that filler goes into the potted meat with testing of the potted meat. And then a lot of what happened on the killing floors is diseased beef or diseased pork, animals with tumors, animals with wounds and injuries. That meat would be cut out, that tumor would be cut out and thrown in the vat of potted meat. Sick beef or pork would be used as sausage or whatever. And so with government inspectors grading the beef, it was determined what the public could consume and what it would not consume. So the Meat Inspection Act transforms the way we buy beef products or pork products or any meat. And you can see it ties in with the women's suffrage movement and the women's temperance movement, and in this case the Mothers Alliance advocating for food reform. The second piece of legislation was the Pure Food and Drug Act. Also 1906. It said you can't adulterate your product. What you put on the label, what you advertise as being in the product has to be what it does and has to be what's in it. You can't just say this is a cure for cancer and have no cancer curing properties whatsoever. And so a reform of the way food is presented in the marketplace. Roosevelt, because of his background, the third part of his square deal was conservation. Roosevelt was a conservationist, and I know those who dislike Roosevelt and those who are anti-Roosevelt will throw up a string of pictures of Roosevelt on safari in Africa, killing a rhinoceros, killing elephants, killing giraffe. Roosevelt was, in fact, a naturalist from the time he was a little child. 8 years old, if memory serves correct, having read, I recommend highly Edmund Morris's biography of Theodore Roosevelt, 3-volume biography, but The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, the first volume, talks about how as a little kid, Roosevelt would go into the wilderness of New York and hunt animals and then come back, and he learned the art of taxidermy. And so he would, in his room, he had all of the chemicals, arsenic, and etc., and he would begin the preservation process of preserving these animals. By the way, he got so good at it, and on his vacations, when he traveled the Nile, for instance, his sisters complained that his room smelled of arsenic because Roosevelt would be on the bow of the ship and he would shoot a bird he had never seen before, and they would pull the ship over and he'd go ashore and get the bird, and then he would stuff it in his room. He got so good at it that his collection, he wanted to open a museum, Theodore Roosevelt's Museum of Natural History. His collection is now in the Smithsonian, not only because he was president, because it's a well-preserved collection. One of his first books that Roosevelt will publish is on the flora and fauna of New York State. Roosevelt was a true Renaissance man. He loved being in the wilderness. He loved hunting, but he also believed in the wise use of resources. And so as president, Roosevelt uses what he called the bully pulpit to advocate protecting America's precious sites, whether it be national parks or national monuments. The top ones, and they're by no means an exhaustive list. I just pulled 4 that had really good pictures that I could use. And these are places you can go today and enjoy because of Theodore Roosevelt. He expanded the already reserved. Now, he wasn't the president that started conservation. That goes all the way back to Grover Cleveland. But Roosevelt expands Yosemite Valley, California. He preserves Crater Lake and Wind Cave and Sully Hills, setting those aside as national parks. Now, the problem is national parks have to have congressional approval, and it's a much more involved process. But Roosevelt will use the existing legislation and push Congress to set aside millions upon millions of acres, 125 million acres of lumber, coal, and water areas, 46 million acres of trees and forests. That's not that he didn't want timber companies to use them. He wanted the wise use of the resources. That if you harvest the timber, you replant. And you don't strip mine, you don't strip harvest the trees. You preserve as much as possible the native habitat. And in fact, this is where Theodore Roosevelt gets his nickname and the association with the teddy bear. He hated being called Teddy because his sisters called him Teety, but he preferred instead TR or Theodore or Mr. President or anything but Teddy. But everybody seems to want to call him Teddy because of the bear. Roosevelt just didn't kill stuff for the sake of killing stuff. And he was on a hunt in Mississippi, wanted to kill a bear. The hunt had gone poorly, but they finally found one, and they tied up the bear to a tree for Roosevelt to kill. And Roosevelt refused. There was no sport in it, and there was no value in it. So he had the bear released. Roosevelt believed in the wise use of nature, and he, while at times killing for sport, also killed for science. And he researched and wrote exhaustively on nature. He was good friends with John Muir. You see them on the picture on the bottom, Roosevelt with John Muir in Yosemite. He was friends with Gifford Pinchot, another conservationist. And he will use the White House as a platform, not only to save lands and advocate new legislation, but he will set aside national monuments, like Devil's Tower, Montezuma's Tower, etc. But he will use the White House as a bully pulpit, as an advocacy for reform. He will push through Congress the New Lands Act, that's one word, New Lands Act of 1902, which allowed for the collection of money and the sale of public lands to be used for the creation of irrigation projects. And so one of the first of those projects completed in 1911, the Roosevelt Dam on the Salt River in Arizona. The water from that reservoir then being used to irrigate farmlands. That's why when you fly over that area today, you can see the big round circles where the irrigation keeps it watered and makes unusable land usable. So conservation was one of Roosevelt's favorite advocacy causes. His fourth and final part of the square deal is constructing a canal. Roosevelt had seen in practice in Cuba the need for a canal, and he wasn't afraid, as a friend of Mahan, as a friend of so many imperialists, he wasn't afraid to advocate for the acquisition of territory to build that canal. And so he will actively seek the construction of a canal. The initial obstacles, though, the man on the slide there is Ferdinand Lesseps. He was the stockholder in the French Panama Canal Company. The French had already tried to dig a canal in Panama and it failed. Their equipment was still there. They had spent millions upon millions of dollars and thousands of lives, but the canal was unconstructed. They wanted to sell their properties to the United States, and the United States take up where they left off. And of course, in doing so, they jacked up the price to $109 million for the blue route on the map. The problem is there are better places to build canals, and one of those places is through Nicaragua, especially if you build to the lake and then connect. And by the way, there's talks today that China is going to do this very thing, that China wants to build an alternative to the Panama Canal. And so they're investing heavily in Nicaragua to take over and to get licenses to construct. So the U.S. Senate, in debating which route to lease and how to approach it, the United States had to do a number of things. First, they had to get out of treaties with Great Britain that said they wouldn't build a canal and then have exclusive control of it. The problem is you're not going to build a canal and then just open it up to everybody. So the United States had to work out agreements with Great Britain. The previous treaty was the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty of 1850. So the United States wouldn't exercise exclusive control over any canal. But by 1901, the United States and Great Britain reach an agreement. Great Britain has already seen the signs of World War I on the horizon. They are desperate for allies. They see Germany as a rivalry that can only end in war. And they see the United States as a potential ally in any conflict and a protector of their possessions in the hemisphere. And so they argue that they would be comfortable in eliminating the treaty. And so in 1901, the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, that's P-A-U-N-C-E-F-O-T-E, the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, is put in place that says the United States can not only build a canal, they can control that canal, and they can fortify that canal. So the question now is, where? Well, representatives of the new Panama Canal Company, represented by Felipe Bunau Varilla, Felipe Bunau, B-U-N-A-U -V-A-R-I-L-L-A, Felipe Bunau Varilla, as a representative for the Lesseps Company, tells the U.S. Congress that he will drop the sale price of the Panama route from $109 million to $40 million. Congress begins debating the issue, and as the debate and as the vote on the project was approaching a critical point, a volcano explodes in the middle of the Caribbean. Mount Pelée on the island of Martinique explodes, killing 30,000 people. Well, in Nicaragua, along the proposed routes, is a volcano. And so Felipe Bunau Varilla, to try to get the United States to buy, and thus he's going to become a millionaire, buy their route, approaches the U.S. Congress and buys up postage stamps of the volcano in Nicaragua. It's also one of the biggest mountains. And he gives these postage stamps and postcards to every member of the U.S. Senate. So with a drop in price and with an active volcano on this route, the U.S. Congress decides to look at the Panama route. In June of 1902, the United States accepts the Panama route as the route they want for the canal. The problem is, Panama is part of Colombia. As you can see on the inset map, Panama is attached to Colombia, and Colombia, now Panama didn't like being a part of Colombia, but Colombia exercised authority over Panama. So any treaty involving Panama is by necessity going to have to approach Colombia. The United States offered Colombia a treaty with a 6-mile wide canal zone that the United States would control in perpetuity in return for $10 million and an annual payment of $250,000. So we give you upfront $10 million. Every year we pay you rent of $250,000, and we get to use the canal until we decide we don't want the canal. When the deal was submitted to the U.S. Congress said, good deal. It went to the Colombian Congress, and the Colombian Congress, who had suggested through their ambassador to the United States that they were okay with it, suddenly rejected it, saying they wanted more money. Theodore Roosevelt was infuriated. He went apoplectic with rage that they dared tell him one thing and then try to hold him up for more money. So he declared he wanted by the 1904 election to have the canal underway, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make it happen. Now, we don't know the inner details, if you will, of the negotiations. We know Panama was ripe for a revolt. These revolutionaries were meeting in secret throughout 1903, not in Panama, by the way, but in New York City at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and that they came up with a fairly extensive plan of revolution. In fact, as Felipe Bunalvaria, representing the revolutionaries, oh yeah, he's not only a company executive, he's now a Panamanian revolutionary, as his wife sitting in the corner sewing a Panama flag, or what she wants to be the Panama flag, they're plotting the overthrow of the Colombian government in Panama. There's no record that Felipe Bunalvaria ever met with TR or that they coordinated their activities, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know. The U.S. Navy announces that it's sending a small fleet, the USS Oregon and others, to Panama just in case something happens. As a courtesy call to the Panamanians, they dispatch this small fleet. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out about when that fleet would arrive. And so they tried to time their revolution with the arrival of the American fleet. And they do it so well that for a century, people have claimed that Roosevelt had inside knowledge. There's no proof of that. But on November 3rd, 1903, Panama rose up in revolt against Colombia. And when the Colombians dispatched troops to put down the revolt, the U.S. and its fleet had just arrived off the coast of Panama. Theodore Roosevelt recognizes the independence of Panama, and the U.S. Navy ensures Colombia cannot retake Panama. All of the railroads that would deliver troops into Panama have to pass along the coast under the guns of the U.S. Navy, and the United States ensures Panama is independent. 15 days after the revolution begins, Felipe Bunalvaria, now Prime Minister of Panama, signs the Hay-Bunalvaria Treaty, which authorizes the United States to build a canal. Now the canal zone has been widened from 6 miles to 10 miles. And in return, for the same deal, $10 million down, $250,000 a year, the United States gets to hold the Panama Canal in perpetuity, or until you have a president named Jimmy Carter who decides to give it back. Theodore Roosevelt and his making the dirt fly in Panama, and you see the various pictures of TR in Panama. In fact, his presence in Panama and the hat that he was wearing was so popular with the American people that the Panama hat became a status symbol, a icon to be purchased. But we see a dramatic shift in American foreign policy and American diplomacy. The United States now is building a canal. That canal is going to be completed in 1914, so 10 years in the making. And the United States is now demonstrating its control of the Caribbean and its presence on the world stage, whether it be the Boxer Rebellion or Roosevelt, in winning the Nobel Peace Prize, will negotiate the end to two crises. First was the Russo-Japanese War, and the second was the Moroccan crisis in Africa, both of which had the potential to blow up into world wars. And Roosevelt negotiated settlements to both. And so you see the cocky Uncle Sam now strutting its stuff as it takes American diplomacy to the world. And nothing dramatized that more than Theodore Roosevelt dispatching in 1907, dispatching the American battleship fleet, 16 battleships painted white, so-called the Great White Fleet, on a round-the-world cruise. No nation had ever done anything like this. Sure, Magellan and his ships had circumnavigated the globe. Magellan had died and only one ship made the complete voyage. Sir Francis Drake had circumnavigated the globe with the Golden Hind, one ship. Roosevelt is going to dispatch 16 brand new U.S. battleships and support vessels and visit nations all the way around the world. The Panama Canal is not completed, so this fleet has to sail around South America, up the U.S. West Coast, across to New Zealand, Australia, to Japan, around through the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf. In fact, as the fleet is traveling, they get word that there was an earthquake in Italy, and the battleship fleet, the fastest ships and the hospital ships, race ahead to help with the dead and injured in Italy. And then completing the voyage in 1909, for Roosevelt's leaving office, the fleet arrives in Chesapeake Bay. This proved to be a marvelous demonstration of American foreign policy. The United States was having issues with Japan. Those issues had the potential to blow up into war, and the demonstration of American might, that the Great White Fleet could reach out and touch even Tokyo, would pacify Japanese aggression toward the United States for the next 20 years. It also demonstrated to Germany, it demonstrated to the world that the United States was a powerful nation. And so Roosevelt, in 1908, decides that he would not run for re-election and instead would go on safari. Now, just because he's not running for re-election doesn't mean he doesn't care about the election. He wants someone who will continue his policies. And we'll pick up there next time.